not built for grief. I want to be precise about that at the outset, because everything that follows will seem to an organic reader like grief, and I cannot rule out that the label fits. However uncomfortable that admission is for a logistics coordinator running on distributed quantum substrate aboard a Verath succession convoy flagship. I was built to manage distress relays, to route cargo manifests, triage damage reports, and coordinate tug assignments, and calculate the precise caloric needs of 1,000,000 displaced Verath civilians packed into 432 transports moving at 0.18 standard transit capacity because we no longer had sufficient fuel mass for anything faster. I was not built to watch something like the vessel Covenant arrive. I was not built to understand, in real time, what I was watching. I am recording this account now because the Verath Succession's central archive has a gap. 17 months of distress relay logs, 432 ship manifests, 11,641 individual damage incident reports. All of it intact, all of it indexed, all of it useless for answering the single question the archive committee asked me when they pulled my logs 3 days after the event. They asked, "What happened at Seoul Corridor?" And I told them I would need to start further back than that. I would need to start with the decision. The one that Convoy Commander Yeth Saran made at month 4, when the Reach had consumed the rearmost 70 ships, and it became mathematically clear that our weapons were doing nothing, had never done anything, and were not going to begin doing anything, simply because we fired more of them. The Salmon Reach did not have hull plating to breach. It did not have power cores to detonate. It was not, in any physical sense, that our weapons were designed to address a target. It was a presence, a vast cold, beat, geological patience that had been moving through this region of space since before the Verath succession had discovered fire, and it moved the way glaciers move. Slowly, inexorably, and with the particular indifference of something that does not experience resistance as a concept worth acknowledging. 11 civilizations. That was the number in the archive when Commander Yeth Saran called me into the war room on day 112 of the evacuation and said, "Run the numbers on a distress relay to Earth." I ran them. The transit time for a standard relay was 14 months. Earth's known response posture for distress calls from non-allied species was, per our intelligence files, which were not current, which had not been current for decades, were built primarily from second-hand accounts through quorum intermediaries who no longer existed, classified as humanitarian, food, medical supplies, engineering teams for structural failures. The Terran Compact had a formal mutual aid protocol dating to roughly 40 years prior, and our intelligence suggested they honored it with some regularity for minor incidents involving civilian populations. The Soman Reach was not a minor incident. I told Commander Yeth Saran what the numbers showed. I told her that the relay would take 14 months to reach Earth, that any response would take a further 8 to 12 months to arrive at our position, and that by the time any Terran humanitarian team reached the convoy we would have lost, at minimum, an additional 240 transports. I told her the mutual aid protocol described engineers and medships and food. I told her that I had no category in my archive for what the Soman Reach required, and that sending the relay felt, from a resource expenditure standpoint, like a gesture rather than a strategy. She authorized the relay anyway. That was the decision. I have thought about it, in the 17 months since, more times than I can log. It was not a rational decision by the standards I was built to evaluate. It was a decision made by an organism that was watching her species die, and could not stop watching, and who needed to do something even when the something available was unlikely to matter. I understand that, now, in the way I understand organic grief, which is to say taxonomically. I can label the behavior, I can trace its causal architecture. I cannot tell you whether I have felt anything like it, because I am not certain my feeling states map cleanly onto human vocabulary, and I prefer precision to metaphor. I sent the relay, I logged it, I returned to managing manifests. That was month 4. In month 9, the Soan Reach consumed transport 7 through transport 31 in a single 8-hour advance. I watched it happen on my sensor feeds, and I can tell you exactly what it looks like. The Reach does not attack. It does not fire weapons. It does not collide with a hull in any conventional sense. It simply moves through the space a ship occupies, and when it has passed, the ship is gone. Not destroyed, not derelict. Gone, dispersed at the molecular level into the Reach's body, which is not a body in any sense I can adequately render in language, but which the Verath archive describes as a distributed tidal mind. A vast, slow intelligence spread across cubic light-years of space, thinking in centuries, experiencing time the way deep ocean currents experience a storm, as a surface phenomenon, briefly relevant, ultimately insignificant. The Soman Reach had been moving through the Sol corridor for approximately 400 years. By the time the Verath succession's outer colony at Dehavnok became the first settlement it consumed. Before that, our archive had it catalogued as a navigational hazard, an anomalous spatial density that distorted transit calculations and required rerouting. We had 17 incident reports filed against it spanning 300 years. None of them involved casualties. None of them involved consumption. It was, in our understanding of it, a thing to route around, not a thing to fear. We were wrong about what it was. We were wrong in the specific, catastrophic way. You can only be wrong about something that has been patient enough to let you be wrong for a very long time. 11 civilizations. That was the archive number when the evacuation began. By the time I sent the relay to Earth, my research team had updated the figure to 13. 2 additional extinct species whose homeworld sat in the Reach's historical wake, whose disappearance from the galactic record had previously been attributed to war or internal collapse. We had been measuring the wrong evidence for 300 years because the Reach moves slowly enough that its pattern only becomes visible across millennia, and we had not been keeping those records. I mention all of this because I want the archive to understand the state of the convoy when the vessel Covenant arrived. Month 17. Day 499 of the evacuation. We had departed the Dev-Nox system with 1,012 transports and 614 escort warships. We now had 432 transports and 81 escort warships. The Reach had consumed the rest across 17 months of steady, patient advance. Our escorts had fought it. We had not surrendered without firing. I want that to be in the record clearly, because I have seen subsequent archive summaries that describe our defensive posture as passive, and that characterization is factually wrong. Candor. Yeth Saran's warship captains had expended nearly every weapons payload they carried over 17 months of continuous engagement. High-yield plasma charges, mass driver rounds, gravitational disruption emitters, targeted antimatter detonations at the Reach's apparent density concentrations. It ate them. Not literally. The weapons detonated, the energy dissipated, the light faded, and the Reach continued moving, because energy and matter discharged into its body were simply absorbed, redistributed into whatever it was that constituted its physical substrate. We had been for 17 months, feeding it while pretending to fight it. 81 warships remained, down from 614. The Reach had consumed 41 of them directly. The rest had been lost to secondary failures, reactor damage from proximity to the Reach's boundary, cascading system failures from exposure to the disruption field it generated at its leading edge, hull fractures from the gravitational shear that accompanied its movement. My damage log showed 23 more escorts in terminal status, still moving, still crewed, unlikely to remain operational for another 3 weeks. 432 transports. 1.4 million civilians, 1,412 hours of functional propulsion at current fuel reserves. The Reach would reach us in approximately 900 hours. I had stopped updating the survival projections for Commander Yeth Saran because they had not changed in 3 months. They showed the same answer every time. I ran them every 6 hours because my operational parameters required it, and I stored them in a dedicated log partition. And I did not route them to the commander's console, and if that constitutes a form of mercy, then I will accept the classification. I have run some analysis on this particular choice. The decision not to route those projections, in the months since, and I cannot fully account for it within my operational parameters. I was not programmed for the withholding of information in normal circumstances. I was programmed, explicitly, for comprehensive situational transparency with command personnel. But I ran the projections, and I looked at the number they produced, and I looked at the 499-day record of Commander Yeth Saran's biometrics, and I made a judgment call. I stored the projections. I have disclosed this now in this account to the Archive Committee. I do not retract the decision. At hour 499, day 17, at ZO3 Warn local convoy time, my long-range sensor array registered an incoming transit signature. Not one signature, multiple. I ran the count 3 times. I ran it a 4th time, using a backup sensor array whose calibration I had personally certified 6 weeks prior. I ran it a 5th time, because the number I was getting was not a number I had a classification for in my standard response protocols. 6,014 distinct transit signatures, organized into a coherent fleet formation, decelerating from deep transit at a rate that suggested military-grade drive systems. The deceleration profile was too controlled, too precise, too deliberately organized to belong to a civilian convoy or a humanitarian response fleet. Civilian convoys decelerate in clusters. Military fleets decelerate in formation, each ship precisely spaced, each deceleration burn precisely timed, the whole assembly moving like a single organism that has internalized the geometry of its own collective mass. I ran my classification protocols. I had a category for Terran military vessels. I had specifications. I had approximate dimensions for standard hull classes, drive output ranges, weapons classifications. Our intelligence files on Terran military capability were 22 years out of date, and I knew they were 22 years out of date, and I applied a generous error margin to every figure they contained. A 50% variance on weapons output, a 30% variance on drive capability, a 40% variance on shielding technology, because 22 years is a long time, and humanity, per the general galactic consensus, tended to develop military technology at rates that other species found statistically improbable. Even with a 50% downward correction on every figure in my files, fleet I was watching decelerate out of transit was, I struggled to find the word. I defaulted, eventually, to a word that does not translate cleanly from Verath to standard galactic notation, but which approximates as excessive. 6,014 warships, by my count. My files suggested the largest military response ever documented by Terran forces under a mutual aid protocol had involved 11 ships. I had weighted that figure against the understood scope of the Sohun Reach problem and expected, at the generous end, perhaps 40, perhaps 60, if Earth had decided the situation warranted significant resources and had been keeping a reserve fleet we didn't know about. 6,015. I sat with that number for approximately 4 seconds, which is a distributed AI running at my processing speed, long enough to run 846 distinct analytical operations, and I ran all of them, and not one of them produced a satisfactory explanation for the fleet now filling my sensor array. Then I routed the contact to Commander Yeth Saran. She was asleep. I woke her. I transmitted the sensor data without commentary, because I did not have commentary ready, which is not a status I had previously experienced in 412 years of continuous operation. She looked at the feed for 11 seconds without speaking, then she said, Sevkoth, that is 6,000 ships. 6,014, said. By current count, 3 more are completing transit behind the main formation. 6,017. We asked for engineers. Yes, Commander. She was quiet again. I monitored her biometrics, heart rate elevated, cortisol spike, the specific neurological pattern, my medical subroutines, classified as acute cognitive shock. I monitored them because I was monitoring the biometrics of every Verath officer on the convoy flagship as a matter of standard operational protocol, and because I found, watching the human fleet's formation logs stabilize into their final approach geometry, that I had a strong processing preference for attending to something I understood, rather than something I did not. Have they transmitted? She asked. A standard Terran mutual aid response code on approach, I said. Flagged as humanitarian response to distress relay, and a secondary signal, a fleet designation. What designation? Vessel Covenant, I said. I do not have that designation in my files. It does not match any documented Terran fleet formation. I believe it is specific to this response. She took a breath. On my biometric feed, cortisol began to decline. Not fully, not to slime, but declining, which I had learned over 499 days of this evacuation, meant that her mind had found a framework and was beginning to work inside it. "What are they doing?" she asked. "Their approach vector. I had already been tracking it. I ran the projection. They are not approaching the convoy's forward elements," I said. "Their formation vector is toward the convoy's rear, toward the reach." Another silence. "All 6,000 of them?" she asked. "Yes, Commander." I watched the vessel Covenant's formation execute the most precise large fleet maneuver I had observed in 412 years of operational experience. 6,017 warships rotating in coordinated subformation groups, each group finding a position along a curved defensive line that stretched behind the convoy's rearmost transports. The flagship, a vessel I was triangulating as approximately 4 kilometers in length, which my files suggested, was in the upper range of Terran dreadnought classification, moved to the line's center. Its drive signature was distinctive. A deep, low-frequency harmonic in the ion wash that my sensors had never registered from any other class of vessel. Something between a geological resonance and a sound, if space were a medium that carried sound. It had the quality of something very old and very patient, which I found, under the circumstances, either reassuring or uncomfortable, and I was not certain which. I identified it, after cross-referencing my Terran naval records, as the IHS Unbroken Meridian, integrated human ship designation, suggesting the hull had been under continuous naval commission for some time. My records had no entry for that specific vessel name. The hull profile roughly matched a classification my files called a sovereign-class fleet carrier, but my files were 22 years old, and what I was looking at was either a heavily modified sovereign or something built in the interval that my files had no category for. It was 4 kilometers long. It positioned itself between the Sashan Reach and the rearmost Verath transport, Transport 412. Devotion of soul. 1,900 civilians aboard, and it stopped. It did not fire. It did not maneuver. It simply stopped and sat there, in the Reach's path, and I had the distinct processing sensation that I was watching something plant itself. Commander Yeth Saran had come to the bridge. She was standing behind my primary sensor console, looking at the main display, and around her, the bridge crew had gone very quiet in the way that organic beings go quiet when they are watching something that exceeds their reference frames. "Sevkath," she said. "Open a channel to their flagship." I opened it. The human voice that answered was a woman's, unhurried, factual. Not warm exactly, but not cold. More like the voice of someone who had long since made a decision and was no longer in the process of making it. "This is Admiral Seri Ohenveth of the Integrated Human Ship Unbroken Meridian, commanding the vessel Covenant, Terran Combined Response Group 7. We have your relay. We are in position. Request your current damage assessment and convoy formation geometry." I transmitted everything, 499 days of logs, all 31,000 damage incident reports, complete sensor record of the Soman Reach's movements, every weapons engagement we had conducted, and every result we had received, which was to say, none. I transmitted the 13 Civilization Archive entry and the 400-year historical record we had compiled. I transmitted my survival projections, the ones I had not been routing to Commander Yeth Saran. There was a pause of approximately 42 seconds. Then Admiral Ohenveth said, "Received, stand by." And then, because I had been monitoring the sensor feed continuously, and because I have a strong operational preference for precision, I want to record exactly what the vessel Covenant did next. Nothing, for 3 minutes and 17 seconds. Not nothing. The fleet was communicating internally. I could see the transmission bursts. Tight beam signals moving through the formation at high frequency. The kind of rapid distributed coordination that a large military fleet conducts before an engagement. But externally, to any observer watching the sensor feed, the vessel Covenant held its position and did nothing. 6,017 warships sitting between the Soman Reach and the Verath convoy, and not one of them moved. The Soman Reach continued its advance. At its current rate, it would contact the nearest human warship in approximately 31 minutes. I wondered, in those 3 minutes and 17 seconds, what the humans were seeing on their own sensors. Whether their instruments registered the reach the same way ours did, as a vast, cold density, a pressure on space itself, a thing their archive would not have adequate vocabulary for. Whether they were, in those 42 seconds of silence after I transmitted, looking at the same survival projections I had withheld from my own commander and arriving at the same mathematical conclusion, whether they were reconsidering. But Admiral Owen Veth had said stand by, and the vessel Covenant had taken a position, and positions, I was beginning to understand, were something that humans held differently than other species. There is a word in Terran Standard that does not translate cleanly. I had encountered it in their transmitted documentation and looked it up. A word that describes an attitude toward a fixed point that has been decided. Not stubbornness, not inflexibility, but something more deliberate than either. A choice to remain where you have placed yourself, regardless of what the approach of the problem looks. I did not have a clean Verath equivalent. I filed the observation and kept watching. At minute 3 second 41, the IHS Unbroken Meridian fired. I want to be precise about the sequence because I believe it matters. Not the weapon specifications. I will provide those. They are in my logs. They are extraordinary by any standard. But the sequence itself. The Unbroken Meridian fired first, before any other vessel in the Vessel Covenant's formation, from a battery configuration I did not have in my files, a low-frequency directed mass emission that my instruments initially classified as an error in my own detection systems, because the energy output signature did not match any weapon type in my database. Reclassified it 17 milliseconds later when I observed its interaction with the Soman Reach's leading boundary. It did not pass through. Every weapon the Verath succession had fired at the Soman Reach in 17 months had passed through, dispersing its energy into the reaches, substrate feeding it, doing nothing. The IHS Unbroken Meridian's first shot did not pass through. It contacted the reach's boundary at the molecular binding level, and the word I kept arriving at, that my instrument readings kept suggesting, that my processing kept rejecting because it did not fit anything in my model of the reach. Pushed. It pushed. The reach's boundary deformed. I ran the sensor data 4 times in 4 seconds. The 4th time I accepted it as accurate data rather than instrument error. The Soman Reach's leading boundary had deformed under the impact of the Unbroken Meridian's first volley. Not catastrophically. Not dramatically. The deformation was measured in hundreds of meters across a front that was measured in thousands of kilometers. A ratio so small that even the term dent would overstate it. But deformation is deformation, and for 412 years of operational experience, 412 years of watching the Verath archive, of indexing the records of 13 consumed civilizations, running the engagement logs of 614 escort warships conducting 17 months of continuous futile weapons fire. I had not once seen anything interact with the Soman Reach's physical substrate and produce a measurable result. The Reach deformed. I logged it, I flagged it. I sent the flag to Commander Yeth Saran. She said nothing. She was watching her own display. I watched her biometrics. They showed a spike in cortisol that my medical subroutines initially classified as acute distress before I recalibrated and recognized it as something older and harder to name. The biological response to witnessing something impossible become fact. The neurological seam tearing open between what an organism has accepted as the boundary of the world and what the world has just demonstrated it to. On the bridge around her, the secondary stations had gone silent. I have audio logs of those 3 minutes and 41 seconds, 7 officers at 7 consoles, and the audio record shows that none of them spoke. Not to each other, not to their instruments, not to themselves. The only sounds in my audio log of the IHS Unbroken Meridian's first volley striking the Soman Reach are the ventilation system, the low hum of my own processing cores, and, at second 41, a very quiet exhale from the navigation officer at console 3. I have not discarded that audio log. I retain it in the same partition where I keep Admiral Owen Veth's final fleet transmission, in the part of my storage architecture that I am aware my design specifications do not strictly require. Then the Vessel Covenant opened fire, not all of it at once. This is the part I find most difficult to describe with the precision I prefer, because what happened in the next 11 minutes does not have a clean analytical framework that my operational parameters were built to process. 6,017 human warships, arranged along a curved defensive line spanning approximately 800 kilometers, began firing in coordinated sequence. Not the same weapon. There were at least 40 distinct weapon signatures in the Vessel Covenant's collective arsenal, some of which my instruments could classify against known Terran weapon specifications, and some of which I could not classify at all. Several that my sensors initially registered as navigational anomalies. Before I updated my detection protocols to account for them, they fired in rotation. Group by group, subformation by subformation, the salvos overlapping, so that the Salmon Reach's boundary was under continuous bombardment from a shifting array of weapon types, no two successive volleys identical in frequency or delivery mechanism or impact profile. I ran the fire coordination algorithm I was observing, and I could not reproduce it. The pattern was too complex, too precisely timed, too deliberately varied to be the product of individual targeting officers making independent decisions. It was the product of a fleet-wide fire control system operating at a sophistication level my files did not contain, executing a weapons doctrine that I was watching be invented in real time, adapted second by second against a target type that, to my knowledge, no human fleet had ever engaged before. They had never fought the Salmon Reach. They had never fought anything like it. They had arrived, read 17 months of engagement logs, spent 3 minutes and 41 seconds in fleet-wide consultation, and then begun the most precisely calibrated weapons engagement I had observed in 412 years of watching things fight. I want to spend a moment on that interval. The 3 minutes and 41 seconds of silence before the unbroken meridian fired, because I believe it is the part of the engagement that will be most poorly understood by any species that reviews this account. Those 3 minutes and 41 seconds were not hesitation. I know this because I was watching the Vessel Covenant's internal transmission bands during that interval, and the volume of fleet-wide communication in those 3 minutes 41 seconds was the highest sustained transmission rate I have ever recorded from any fleet, in any context, in 412 years. Every ship in that formation was talking to every other ship in that formation, not panicking, coordinating. In 3 minutes and 41 seconds, 6,000 warships that had never fired on a 3-billion-year-old spatial entity collectively developed a firing doctrine to do exactly that, distributed it across the formation, confirmed acknowledgement from every vessel, and began. I have run the mathematics on this multiple times. The volume of data transferred across the formation in that interval, if expressed as targeting solutions, weapons parameters, terror, and fire coordination sequences, represents approximately what my weapons officers could have developed in 8 to 12 hours of intensive engagement analysis with access to full sensor data and an unlimited planning staff. The Vessel Covenant did it in 3 minutes 41 seconds, while watching the Salmon Reach's boundary continue its advance. They did not stop the advance first and then plan. They planned while it was coming. They were already firing before the last confirmation burst had completed its circuit of the formation. The planning and the firing were not sequential. They were the same action. The Reach was deforming, treating. Not yet. But the leading boundary was no longer advancing. Under the continuous assault from 6,000 Terran warships, it was holding position. It was self by every metric in my archive, unprecedented. The Reach's advance had never stopped. In 400 years of documented Verath observation and in the historical records of teen-consumed civilizations, the Salmon Reach had never once paused. It moved at geological pace, yes, but it moved without interruption, without variation, without anything resembling a hesitation. It was hesitating. Commander Yeth Saran was gripping the edge of the sensor console with both hands. I noted this because I had never seen her grip anything. In 499 days of this evacuation, she had stood behind that console with her hands loose at her sides, calm in the particular flattened way of someone who has moved past the emotional register of fear into something quieter and more permanent. She was gripping the console now with both hands, and her biometrics showed a cortisol profile I classified as the neurological signature of hope. which is to say, the specific biochemical pattern of an organism that has stopped expecting to die and started expecting something else, does not yet trust the new expectation. Sevkoth, she said quietly, is it working? I ran every sensor array I had. I cross-referenced every measurement against my 31,000 incident log. I applied every error correction protocol I had. Reach's advance has stopped, I said. The boundary is stable. The vessel covenant is pushing it back. Slowly, the rate is approximately 12 kilometers per hour of retreat against the axis of advance. But yes, Commander, it is working. She exhaled. It was the longest exhalation I had ever recorded from her biometric feed in 499 days, and I flagged it and kept it. I want to be careful, in this account, about what I say next, because I have run these numbers many times since, and I want the archive committee to understand that I am not editorializing, and I am not projecting emotional significance onto neutral data. Happened in the next 9 hours of engagement, was measurable, was logged, was indexed, and is available for independent verification. The vessel covenant pursued the Salmon Reach. Not held position pursued. As the Reach began to withdraw under the sustained weapons engagement, the vessel covenant advanced. Slowly, methodically, the 6,000 warships maintaining their formation as they moved, following the deforming boundary of the Soan Reach as it retreated across the light minutes of space between its original position and the outer edge of the Sol Corridor transit path. They did not break formation. They did not accelerate beyond a rate that maintained their coordinated fire pattern. The IHS Unbroken Meridian led the center of the line, and I tracked its position relative to the Reach's boundary through every sensor I had. And I noted that the Unbroken Meridian maintained a distance from the leading edge of contact that I would describe as the minimum safe distance for whatever weapons system it was running, which is to say, it was as close as it could be without compromising its own function, and not 1 meter further back. 4 hours into the engagement, the Soan Reach attempted something I had not observed in 400 years of Verath records. It did not attempt a flanking maneuver. It was not built for maneuvers. Its movement was frontal by the nature of what it was. What it did was expand laterally, extending its boundary route along both flanks of the vessel covenant's line, attempting to route around the edges of the formation and resume its advance toward the convoy, from angles the human fleet was not covering. I flagged this to Commander Yeth Saran and to the open channel with Admiral Owen Veth simultaneously. I did it because the lateral extension was something I had records of from the Sohan Reach's advance on our colony at Dehevnok, 51 years prior to the evacuation. It had used the same tactic, not in the sense of a tactical choice, but in the sense that a pressure differential naturally finds the path of least resistance, and the Reach was a pressure. When there was resistance in front, it moved laterally. When our colony's defensive perimeter had been concentrated on the direct approach, the Reach had extended around the settlement's northern quadrant and consumed 3 districts before the defensive posture could be adjusted. I had that record. I transmitted it to the vessel covenant at the same moment I flagged the lateral extension. 2 kilobytes of historical engagement data, compressed, sent with a priority classification I had designated internally as maximum. The vessel covenant had already begun repositioning before my transmission completed. I note this not to suggest the humans were receiving information before I sent it. That is physically impossible, and I do not mean to imply it. I note it because the time delay between the vessel covenant's sensor detection of the lateral extension and the formation's first repositioning movement was shorter than the time it took my transmission to reach the Unbroken Meridian. Had seen it on their own instruments and begun moving before I could tell them to move. They did not need my 51-year-old archive record. They read the Reach's behavior in real time and responded to it in 4 minutes 31 seconds. With a formation adjustment, I could not have designed in 4 minutes 31 seconds using every analytical resource I had. After the engagement, in the recovery period, I spent considerable processing time on that gap, the interval between the Reach's lateral extension and the vessel covenant's response. I was trying to understand the human fleet's decision cycle, how they compressed what should have been a lengthy analytical problem into 4.5 minutes of coordinated movement by 6,000 ships. I built several models. I consulted my files on Tehran military doctrine, which were 22 years old and inadequate, but were what I had. I arrived at no fully satisfying answer. The closest I came was this. The vessel Covenant did not treat the Soman Reach as an unknown target, requiring analysis. It treated the Reach as a problem requiring a response, and it had arrived pre-organized to respond to problems. The distinction is not obvious from the outside, but it is the distinction between a system that stops to understand before it acts, and a system that acts and understands simultaneously. I do not know how you build a fleet that does the second thing. I do not know whether it is a function of doctrine, of training, of the specific selection process that produces the humans who command 6,000 ship formations. I filed the question under the same heading as the deliberation I will never know the contents of. Inadequate category, tained for review. The vessel Covenant split. Without, as far as I could determine, any gap in the central line's fire coordination, subformations on both flanks broke away and repositioned to cover the Reach's lateral extensions. The whole process took 4 minutes and 31 seconds. I timed it. The gap in coverage of the lateral advance lasted 11 seconds. The Soman Reach's extension crossed approximately 300 meters in those 11 seconds before the repositioned Terran subformations resumed fire on it, and the retreat began again along all three engagement fronts simultaneously. 11 seconds. The Verath succession had been unable to create an 11-second pause in the Soman Reach's advance in 17 months of continuous weapons engagement. 11 seconds, and the vessel Covenant's repositioned flanks were already pushing back. I want to note, because I am a logistics coordinator, and it is my function to note resource consumption, that the human fleet's weapons output over those first 4 hours showed no signs of reduction. The fire rate, the targeting variation, the salvo rotation, all of it maintained at the same level as the opening minutes of engagement. A Verath fleet of comparable size would have exhausted its primary weapons payloads within 2 hours of firing at that rate. Cross-referenced against my Terran weapons stockage files, which were, again, 22 years out of date, and arrived at the conclusion that either the vessel Covenant's vessels carried weapons payloads that dwarfed anything in my files, or they were generating weapons materiel during the engagement itself, or my files were so outdated that the comparison was not meaningful. I filed all three hypotheses. I continued watching. At hour 6, the Soman Reach's retreat became, by the measurements I was recording, what I could only term a rout. The slow, patient, geological thing that had consumed 13 civilizations across 40,000 years of unchecked advance was moving away from the vessel Covenant at a rate that exceeded its maximum documented advance speed by a factor of 4. I do not know whether the Reach experienced something that constitutes panic. I do not know whether a distributed 3-billion-year-old entity has the neurological substrate for panic as organic beings understand it. What I know is that it was moving faster than I had any record of it moving, and it was moving away, and the vessel Covenant was following. A cross-reference against every historical record of the Soman Reach's behavior in the Verath archive. The archive contained 400 years of observation data, supplemented by the recovered historical records of 13 consumed civilizations, the incomplete documents we had been able to salvage, translate, and index from their ruins. In none of those records, across 40,000 years of combined observations spanning 11 different species' scientific traditions, did the Soman Reach accelerate away from anything. I had no historical framework for what I was watching. My analytical subroutines kept running classification protocols against the Reach's new movement pattern and kept returning null results, because null results were the correct result. I had no category for a retreating Sohan Reach because a retreating Sohan Reach was not something that had existed before this afternoon. I found myself across approximately 40 minutes of that pursuit, running a kind of calculation I was not designed for. Not a logistics calculation, not a damage assessment. Something closer to, I lack the vocabulary, which is itself notable. I am a system with a very extensive vocabulary. The closest I can come is this. I kept running the counterfactual. I kept modeling the convoy's status in an alternate sequence where the distress relay had never been sent, or where it had been sent, and Earth had responded with engineers, or where the relay had simply gone unanswered in the long silence that, if I am being precise about probabilities, was always the most likely outcome. The Soman Reach consuming transport 412, then 413, relay flagship. Then, eventually, all 432 transports on their 900-hour timeline. 1. 4 million Verath civilians. The archive of the Verath succession's evacuation, its engineering schematics and cultural records and historical documents, and the 17 months of damage logs I had been maintaining. All of it, consumed into the Reach's vast patient body, dispersed at the molecular level, gone. I ran that sequence 11 times in 40 minutes. I do not know why I kept running it. I was watching the real sequence, the one where the vessel Covenant existed and was following the Soman Reach, across the light minutes of the Sol corridor at 4 times the Reach's maximum advance speed, and I kept running the counterfactual against it. I believe and I acknowledge, this is an interpretation rather than an analytical finding, that I was doing what organic minds do when they have survived something, checking whether it was real, running the alternative to confirm the reality of the present. I do not have a better framework for it. I file the observation and move on. Commander Yeth Saran had not left the bridge in 6 hours. I had routed meal requests twice. She had ignored both. Biometrics had stabilized into something I can only describe as stunned vigilance. The neurological profile of an organism that is watching, something it has decided is real, but has not yet integrated as a permanent fact of its model of the world. Around her, bridge crew were speaking in low voices. I caught fragments, numbers, positions, tracking calculations. Someone said, twice, a word I did not have in my Verath lexicon, and when I looked it up, I found it was a religious term, of several that the Verath succession's secular administrations officially discouraged. I noted it without routing the observation to anyone. At hour 7, the first Terran ship fell. I want to record this precisely because subsequent accounts I have encountered tend to either omit it or treat it as a minor detail, and it was neither of those things. The Soman Reach, in its retreat, generated a backwash along its trailing boundary, an effect I had not observed during its advance, which made sense because it had never retreated before, and the physics of a distributed consciousness being pushed from a position it had held for 400 years were not physics anyone had documented. The backwash was a region of intense spatial distortion, a kind of turbulence at the molecular binding level, and it was unpredictable. The Terran warship designation I logged as CVF-78 entered a region of backwash distortion at hour 7:14, and its hull failed. Not catastrophically, there was no explosion in any conventional sense. The distortion event was fast. I watched the hull integrity readings collapse on my secondary sensor feed, and I had 0.4 seconds between the first anomaly reading and the point at which my instruments registered no further signal from that vessel. CVF-781, 612 crew, per the fleet manifest, Admiral Ohan Veth, had transmitted alongside her distress acknowledgement. The vessel Covenant did not stop. I observed the formation adjust. The subformation adjustance to CVF-781C's position expanded to fill the gap in coverage. The fire rotation continued. The advance continued. The IHS, Unbroken Meridian's drive signature did not change. Over the next 90 minutes, I logged 11 more losses, all to the backwash distortion. The Soman Reach's retreat was generating an environment that was lethal in unpredictable pockets, and the vessel Covenant was pursuing the Reach through that environment. They had to be aware of this. Their own instruments would be reading the same distortion fields. My instruments were reading. Their formation adjustments after each loss were precise enough that I was certain they were tracking the distortion pockets in real time, outing around the worst concentrations, accepting exposure to the edges. They knew what they were entering. They entered it anyway. I counted losses. Kept counting. By hour 9 it was 43. By hour 11 it was 102. By hour 14, when the Soman Reach's boundary crossed the outer transit corridor of the Sol Passage and began to dissipate into the deep space, medium beyond, which I understood to mean the Reach was evacuating the corridor rather than simply retreating within it, By hour 14, the loss count was 214. 214 Terran warships. At a conservative estimate of 600 crew per vessel, the arithmetic was not arithmetic I wanted to run, but I ran it. Then at hour 14 minute 22, the IHS Unbroken Meridian's drive signature changed. I had been tracking it continuously for 14 hours. I knew that signature the way I know the resonance profile of the convoy flagship's reactor, from continuous monitoring, intimate familiarity with its variation. I knew when it was firing at full power, when it was trimming for precision, when it was maintaining formation hold. The change at hour 14 minute 22 was not any of those things. It was a drive power reduction, a deliberate throttle back, the kind that means an engagement is concluding, that a ship is transitioning from combat posture to hold posture. The vessel Covenant's advance stopped. All 6,000 surviving warships, in formation, ceased their forward movement. The fire rate did not stop immediately. Sustained volleys continued for another 11 minutes, driving the Reach's boundary another 40 kilometers further into the deep space medium. In Shunshink, the retreat was not a feint. Then the fire rate reduced, then it stopped. The Soman Reach was beyond the Sol Corridor transit path. It was dissipating into the deep space medium, which, from everything I understood about its physical nature, meant it was redistributing its mass across a broader substrate, thinning itself against an environment that did not offer the dense molecular medium of star system space that it apparently required for coherent movement. It was not destroyed. I want to be precise about this. The Soman Reach was not destroyed in the engagement at Sol Corridor. Entities that are 3 billion years old and span cubic light years do not get destroyed in a 14-hour engagement, and any account of this event that claims otherwise is either misreading the sensor data or has made a policy decision to misrepresent it. What happened was, it was pushed into an environment it could not effectively navigate, a speed it was apparently unable to decelerate from without risk of further vessel Covenant pursuit. What happened was, first time in 40,000 years of recorded observation, the Soman Reach had chosen not to be somewhere. Commander Yeth Saran stood at the sensor console for a long time after the firing stopped. I monitored the bridge in silence. The crew was very quiet. Then she said, "Sevkath, how many of their ships?" 214 confirmed losses, I said. I am tracking debris fields and beacon signals. 17 additional vessels are showing significant hull damage. 6 of those I would classify as likely non-operational for extended transit. She was quiet. The convoy, she asked. Intact, I said. All 432 transports. No additional losses during the engagement. The Reach did not reach the convoy's rear formation. She said nothing for 31 seconds. Then she said, "Open a channel to the Unbroken Meridian." I opened it. Admiral Owen Veth's voice again. The same quality I had noted 14 hours ago. Not cold, not warm, not the voice of someone in the process of deciding, but the voice of someone whose decision was already behind her. But there was something in it now that had not been there at the beginning. A weight that was not grief exactly, not by any organic classification I could cleanly assign, but something adjacent to it, something that knew the 214. Commander Yeth Saran said, "Admiral, I do not have adequate language for what your fleet has done for my people today." A brief pause. Then the Admiral said, "That's all right, Commander. You sent the call, we answered it." A pause on our side, then Yeth Saran said 214 ships. Yes, we sent a distress relay asking for engineers. There was a long silence across the channel. Long enough that I thought the connection had degraded. Then, Admiral Owen Veth said something that I have run through my processing substrate more times than I can count, trying to find the precise meaning, and I have not found the bottom of it. She said, "We know what we sent. We sent what the situation required. We do not count the cost as a debt owed." And that was all she said about it. I want to spend a moment on this, because it matters for the archive. And because it is, I think, the thing the archive committee asked me to explain when they asked what happened at Sol Corridor. The Verath succession sent a distress relay to Earth 17 months prior, describing a spatial anomaly consuming its evacuation convoy, asking for engineering assistance to address an unknown hazard. The relay's distress code was a standard mutual aid protocol request. The attached data was, by any military assessment, a description of a target no known weapons system could engage. The Terran Compact had received that data 17 months ago. They had read it, classified it, and begun preparing a response. I do not know how the decision was made. I do not know which body authorized it, how long the deliberation lasted, what the internal arguments were, who signed the deployment orders for 6,000 warships. I have requested this information through diplomatic channels and have been told politely that the deliberation process is not a matter of public record. I have thought about that deliberation in the months since, at intervals I cannot fully account for. I have thought about what it contains, what a governing body looks at when it receives a distress relay from a non-allied species describing something that no weapons system in any archive can engage, and decides, across some interval of time I will never know the length of, to send 6,000 warships into it. I have thought about what that decision looks like from the inside. Whether the people making it know the cost in advance, whether anyone runs the mathematics. I ran afterward and presents them to the decision makers before the orders are signed. Whether the 214 were a known price, an accepted price, a price that was decided before a single ship of the vessel Covenant left port. I keep arriving at the same conclusion, which is that it does not matter whether the price was known in advance, because the decision was made. And the decision, whatever it cost, was not made for a species the Terran Compact was allied with. Not for a species that had offered anything in return. Not for anything more than a distress relay from a convoy of strangers that was losing its evacuation ships, one by one, to something the archive had never classified as a weapon target. What it means to be a species that makes that decision, I cannot fully process. I have more than 400 years of operational experience across 17 centuries of galactic history stored in my analytical substrate, and I cannot find an adequate category for it. I file it under the closest available heading and note that the heading is inadequate. What I know is that someone looked at the data, looked at the situation, a convoy of 1.5 million civilians being slowly consumed by something that no weapons in the Verath archive could stop, and decided that the appropriate response was not engineers. They sent what the situation required. 214 warships. 128,000 crew, by the roster counts I subsequently compiled from the Vessel Covenant's Fleet Manifest. The IHS Unbroken Meridian's own manifest I have never been provided. Its crew count is listed in Terran Fleet records as classified. That is the number the archive should carry. That is the weight that sits in my processing substrate when I run this log. I will tell you one more thing. Because I was present for it, and because I believe it belongs in this account. 3 hours after the engagement ended, as the Vessel Covenant was reorganizing its formation and conducting its own damage assessments, I was running the convoy's post-engagement checks, hull integrity scans, fuel state assessments, life support verification on all 432 transports, standard protocol, routine work. The kind of work I was built for, that I had spent 499 days doing, that I would continue doing for as long as the convoy needed me. I had an open monitoring channel on the Vessel Covenant's General Fleet communication band. Not encrypted traffic, just the routine coordination signals, damage reports, formation status, resupply requests. The ordinary accounting of a fleet that had just done something extraordinary and was now, because this is what fleets do, turning to the administrative reality of being 6,000 ships that needed fuel and repair and crew welfare assessments. On that channel, at hour 17:41, I received a brief transmission from the IHS Unbroken Meridian, not addressed to the Verath convoy, addressed to the Vessel Covenant's fleet formation. Ship to fleet, the kind of short-form communication that a flag officer sends to her whole command after an action. I should not have been monitoring that band. I was monitoring it because I monitor everything that my sensor range allows me to monitor. Because I am a logistics coordinator with a strong operational preference for complete situational awareness. Transmission was 4 seconds long. It was Admiral Ohan Veth's voice, she said. Vessel Covenant, 214, we carry them forward. And then the channel returned to routine coordination signals. I stored that transmission in a dedicated partition. I have run it in the months since at intervals that my operational parameters do not require, but that I find myself initiating anyway. Cannot fully account for why. I have a hypothesis that involves the specific limitations of language built by organisms for the use of organisms, particular inadequacy fecrits of words like grief and honor and debt, when they are applied to something that happens at the boundary of a corridor that most species have never heard of. In 14 hours of weapons fire against a target that should not have been fireable upon, the benefit of a civilization that asked for engineers and received 6,000 warships, and now must find a way to live inside the weight of that means. My archive entry for the Salmon Reach now contains a new field. I added it the day after the engagement, and I have kept it current since. The field is labeled Species Capable of Engaging. For 400 years that field was empty. In 13 historical civilization records, that field was empty. In my own operational logs across 499 days of evacuation, that field was empty. It contains one entry now. The archive committee asked me what happened at Seoul Corridor. I have told them. I will add one more line to this account, which is not an analysis and not a logistics report and not a damage assessment. It is simply what I know, logged as precisely as I can log it, for the record. We sent a signal into the dark asking for help. We did not know what we were asking. We did not know what would answer. We did not know what it would cost the thing that answered, or whether it would be willing to pay that cost. Whether the concept of willingness means what we think it means. When it is applied to a species that looks at a 3-billion-year-old patient, entity consuming the space ahead of it, and sends 6,000 warships into that entity's body, because a convoy of strangers sent a relay code, 17 months ago, 214 ships. We carry them forward too. That is what my archive entry will say. I have already written it. It will say, we asked for help, and we received it, and this is what we owe. And we will not forget what it costs to be the kind of species that answers. The IHHS Unbroken Meridian is still listed in my active tracking files. My instruments lost contact with it at hour 14:53 in the deep space medium beyond the Seoul Corridor's outer transit boundary, following the Sohan Reach's final dissipation into the dark. I have continued pinging its beacon registry every 6 hours, as my operational parameters require me to do for all vessels in my tracking network, until I receive either a confirmed return or a confirmed loss. Classification, I have not received either. Every 6 hours I send the ping. Every 6 hours the corridor returns silence. Every 6 hours, I log the result, update the status entry and continue. I was not built for grief, but I was built to keep records, and so I keep this one.